So the Grail is, if one will pardon the phrase, a kind of melting pot of various traditions, some of them Christian, some of them pagan, some of them European, some specifically Celtic, which get mixed together in curious ways. And everybody who writes about the Grail puts then their own different and characteristic spin on. It's an immensely learned age. And I think one of the things that fascinates us about it is it sort of sets the roots for what we then see as the modern world, unbeknownst to itself at the time. Because I think if you think about Aquinas, the whole point of his Summa is to say, we can understand God. Faith and reason are to be compatible, and reason enables us to understand something of God. That's quite an extraordinary claim. And then, of course, in modernity, the God bit falls out. Reason is then seen as something which will deconstruct God, will lead us to doubt in God. And that's why something, a text as thoroughly medieval as Parzifal is interesting, because one of the key aspects of it is this question that Parzifal puts to his mother, Herzeloid, was ist Gott? What is God? And I think that's still obviously a question with which people of faith are struggling and wrestling today.
Paul Bishop, thanks a lot for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Oh, me too. Parzival is a story that I've wanted to talk about on the podcast for quite some time. I mean, it's a story like the whole Grail legend has really fascinated me since I was a little boy. Probably the first time I was introduced to it was through Monty Python. If you were a precocious Canadian kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, Monty Python was very kind of foundational to your understanding of the world and your sense of humor. And then a little bit later, I think in the late 80s, when Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade came out, I mean, it just kind of further fed my imagination about this mystery.
So I can well believe that, yeah.
Yeah, this has been a long time coming. And I mean, even just kind of dipping into your book over the past few days and kind of getting back into it, the mystery and the fascination is still so alive for me in this story. And I'm hoping like in the course of our conversation that we can touch on maybe some of the reasons why it continues to hold our fascination in such a strong way, you know, almost 1,000 years after it emerged.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And the fascination that you have, the Grail and for Parzifal and all that goes around it, that's also there with Jung as well. So you're in very good company as far as this fascination is concerned.
Yeah, well, I mean, over the years, I've heard or read that Jung thought it was a really foundational story for Western civilization. Rudolf Steiner, I believe, also thought it was very central to understanding us in the West. Joseph Campbell, the scholar Harold Bloom put it as top of the Western canon, and probably a bunch of other people too. But I'm kind of interested, like, maybe before we talk about like your interest in Parsifal, I think it's really about your larger interest in the work of Jung. So I mean, this is the first book in a series that you're writing on these kind of central Western texts, especially because they were so important to Jung himself. So what's your fascination with this character of Carl Jung?
That's right. This the book on Parzifal is beginning of what I hope will be a 4-volume project, and it's tied up with Jung because for Jung, I think these texts were absolutely foundational, and of course he could take for granted that the people that he was dealing with would know them. I mean, they were part and parcel of his cultural background, and I think that's no longer true today. And medieval literature has disappeared off university curricula. Likewise, I'm afraid to say, Goethe and Nietzsche as well are, in some respects, quite marginal. Nietzsche's still sort of hanging in there in continental philosophy departments, but of course, there are fewer and fewer of those. And it's one of the strange things, which is that just as the canon is being put to one side, so these marginal figures, marginal in terms of how the way the academy looks at them, like Jung, it seems to me there's a wonderful opportunity for us to bring all these things together, to rediscover our cultural, our textual, our intellectual, historical past, and Jung is a great person to open up these texts. I mean, the collected works are, it's a little like a little university at home when you've got them on your shelf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the way I think of him sometimes, as this curator of so much of Western history and thought. He's a great way into it. So yeah, just to say that the other books that you have planned are on Goethe's Faust, on
Nietzsche's Zarathustra.
Zarathustra, and then also Jung's Red Book, Liber
And then the
Novus.
Red Book. That's right. So the thesis which I'm trying to explore in this series is that there is a continuity in our culture. There is a continuity of which Jung was very aware. Jung is a great thinker of continuity. He's always looking for those connections. That makes him slightly out of touch with the temperament that we have in our very kind of postmodern approach to literary history, where we're much more
that there is no continuity.
Exactly. And so I think what I hope will be is a kind of double benefit, is helping understand, where Jung got it from, or the tradition of which he's a part. Let's put it like that. But also that it'll encourage people to go back and look at these great canonical texts, because in some way I think they're almost becoming forgotten. And there was one incident which just before the pandemic kicked in. I was at a conference in Stuttgart, to which I'd very kindly been invited to talk. And in the paper, I made a reference to Goethe's Faust. And after the paper, someone came up to me and said, "Well, that's absolutely fascinating, but what is Faust all about? I've never read it." And I thought, oh my goodness, if even the Germans aren't reading
In
Faust,
Germany, yeah.
what hope for the rest of us? And that was then when we had the lockdowns. What I really wanted to do was to thinking of the great phrase by Angelus Silesius, where he says, "Mensch weder wesentlich." So, concentrate on what's really important. And I think these canonical texts are important. And for me, that's why they're canonical. They're not important because they're canonical because they're important. You can say that there is no longer a canon. Well, that's fine, but it's still there. It still exists, even if you don't want to recognize it.
Well, and even just to see that it still captures people's imagination, like even in a kind of diluted form, like Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code had a kind of Grail storyline.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so this was like your pandemic project, was to start diving into these massive, imposing texts. I mean, there's been so much scholarship done on Parzifal. It's really extraordinary.
I mean, in the case of all of them, you've got massive bibliographies, years, decades, in some cases, almost centuries of scholarship that are there, and of course that can become a problem. That can make people be afraid of these texts, which are pretty hefty in their own right. And then they see that the academy has constructed a kind of barrier around them and wants to control the discourse about these texts and control the interpretations and so on. And all that ends up doing, of course, is frightening people away from it. And so what I want to do in the books is both to have a scholarly apparatus, because I think that's important, but also to find a way of inviting people into re-engaging with these texts, engaging or re-engaging with these texts. And one of the reasons, therefore, that I'm going with not the most scientific and the most modern translations, that saves on copyright fees, that's for one thing, but also to make the point is about the affective component of our reaction to these texts as well. So this isn't a strictly philological approach. It's an approach which is trying to open them up to as wide an audience as possible.
Right. So finding not necessarily the most accurate literal translation, but the most effective storytelling and using that to get into the story. Yeah.
That's absolutely right, Brian. And of course, the most accurate translation, if you like, would be to read them in the original German. That's my background, has been in German language and literature. And I'd always encourage people to read text in the original German. German is actually, in my view, a very simple language. Everybody thinks it's it's a difficult language and so on, but it isn't really. It's dead easy. I've got a little grammar sheet, which is two sides of a single A4 sheet of paper, which has all the rules of German grammar on it. And if you've got that, that's it. And I to my students, I say, this is the holy grail of German grammar. It's all on there. And it's true. A little bit more difficult because obviously Parzifal is written in Middle High German, but you can get great editions which are parallel texts, which give the Middle High German on one page, modern German on the other. And the whole point, I think, about a translation is that it should prompt you to go back to the original and have a look at it there.
Oh, I'd love to have that little Holy Grail sheet. German has definitely been.
I'll email it to you. That's no problem.
I'm intrigued by German. Like, half of my ancestry is German, but it's an imposing kind of language. Just looking at the length of those words and trying to wrap your tongue around them is a challenge.
That's right. And there's a very famous little essay by Mark Twain called "The Awful German Language," which I think kind of captures some of the anxieties I have around German and so on. But long words is it's a Lego language. It's a Lego language. You just stick little bits together, and I thought that's why you can get the longer words and so on. But believe you me, it's dead easy. And once you get into it, I think with all languages, I'm not too worried about focusing on the grammatical niceties, but see it as for what it is, which is a mode of communication. Then you can have a lot of good fun with German too.
Great. So I wonder if we could begin by speaking a little bit about the history of like what was going on in Europe at the time that these stories started to emerge, because I think it seems to me like it was a very pivotal point in Western civilization and the kind of movement from the pagan to the Christian.
No, that's right. Jung in his Red Book focuses on this period of the Middle Ages as being something that we still have to work through. The Middle Ages in ourselves, the Middle Ages in others, and so on. And I think the reason why he says that is because the Middle Ages are this pivotal period, as you're talking about. It's a time of immense cultural change, engagement, difficult engagement in terms of cultural affairs. If we think of the Crusades and so on, it's also a very violent period as well. You've got people who are turning against heretics. You've got the immense power of the church. You've also therefore got immense beauty, immense culture, immense intellectual activity that's going on. It's in the medieval period that the first universities are founded and so on. And just as you have these amazing cathedrals which begin to be constructed in the medieval period through into the Gothic, you also have these incredible intellectual artifices, edifices. In the case of the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas, for example. So it's an immensely learned age. And I think one of the things that fascinates us about it is it sort of sets the roots for what we then see as the modern world, unbeknownst to itself at the time. Because I think if you think about Aquinas, the whole point of his Summa is to say we can understand God. Faith and reason are to be compatible, and reason enables us to understand something of God, that's quite an extraordinary claim. And then, of course, in modernity, the God bit falls out. Reason is then seen as something which will deconstruct God, will lead us to doubting God. And that's why something, a text as thoroughly medieval as Parzifal is interesting, because one of the key aspects of it is this question that Parzifal puts to his mother, Herzeloid, was ist Gott? What is God? And I think that's still obviously a question with which people of faith are struggling and wrestling today.
Mm. Yeah, right. So like Parsifal's struggle with God is reflective of that, what was happening in the culture, I guess, at some level.
I think that's absolutely right. We shouldn't think, I think, of the Middle Ages as kind of unproblematic in their belief, and that's clear from Parzifal, which has both a standard set of religious references in terms of the references to the liturgical calendar, which you find in the work. Also, the idea of the importance of Good Friday, that magical Good Friday, as Wagner describes it in his operatic form of the story in the 19th century in Parsifal. But you've also got in Wolfram von Eschenbach's version a very different countercurrent as well. And there's this whole question of how does the Grail, whatever that is, relate to the church? And it seems to be running in parallel to the church. And so in Good Friday, Parzifal is told this is when the white dove descends with the host in its beak and takes it down into the Grail. And this is what then is used to keep the Grail King alive and to bring new life. And you can see there something which is quasi-heretical. It's obviously not orthodox Catholic teaching. It operates within a Catholic framework, but it's doing something which I think is significantly different.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the story, actually, because that's one of the things that makes it an imposing text to get into, is that there are different versions of the story. So the original, as far as I understand it, comes from France, Chrétien de Troyes. He wrote a kind of truncated version of the story, or at least we were only half of it was preserved, or it stops at a certain point, kind of an abrupt point, right?
That's absolutely right. It's incomplete because Chrétien dies, so he's unable to complete what is the last version of a series of courtly epics, and I think it's always difficult when one wants to look for origins, and that's why it's become a fashion to say, well, they don't exist. But there's clearly somewhere where all of this is coming from, and one important source, I think, is Chrétien. Wolfram obviously knows the Chrétien story. Wolfram then also invents different sources. He creates this character called Caillot, whom he says has really got the proper story of the Grail. Chrétien got it wrong. He says, I'm really going back to the original sources. And that's, on the one hand, just a kind of literary device. I think that's how it's commonly looked at. But on the other hand, it's signaling something, which is to say there's maybe something which transcends Chrétien's understanding of the story, since the legend of the Grail is not in its entirety invented by Chrétien. It's rather a kind of mixture that emerges from Christian legend, from Celtic folklore, very, very important element in this, the traditions associated with Apuleius and the Metamorphoses, and Hermetic sources as well. So the Grail is, if one will pardon the phrase, a kind of melting pot of various traditions, some of them Christian, some of them pagan, some of them European, some specifically Celtic, which get mixed together in curious ways, and everybody who writes about the Grail puts then their own different and characteristic spin on it.
Hmm. And couldn't we say also, I mean, it seems like there's evidence that there's also some elements of Arabic mythology or tradition in there. Like there's some alchemical elements that we could find in the story, some Welsh elements, I guess, right?
Yeah,
Like kind of Welsh folklore, like the King Arthur and all of that.
that's
Uh,
right. Yeah,
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 so
that's right.
maybe that's why it's such a foundational text in the eyes of so many, is that it does bring a lot of these aspects of the melting pot, which is Western civilization, together
Yeah,
into a
yeah.
story and a kind of this epic story too of transformation.
I think that's absolutely right. And the reason why, I mean, it's not to say that, Wolfram's version of the Parzifal story is, the only good one, and the rest of them aren't up to much. That's not the case at all. But it is to say, I think that one finds with something with Chrétien's version, which is that um, it's palpably more complex in its outlook, even than Chrétien's, even than some of the other versions and continuations that are there. Um, and I think that's one of the reasons why it is such an important iteration of the story, is that it is both concerned with what is the question of the Grail, but it also has behind it this deeper and more explicit theological question: what is God? And I don't think you'll find that same degree of explicit theological engagement in other versions of the story. Other versions of the story have different elements of appeal, different strengths. In some of them, it's not Parzifal or Percival who is the knight who is
Mhm.
concerned with the Grail. In other versions, it's Gawain. Some are more visionary, some are more down to earth, some are more political, and so on. And that's reflected in the different representations that one finds of the actual Grail itself.
Mm. And post Wolfram, uh, isn't it true that some of the versions that we know or have become popularized came out of the monastic tradition? So they were more kind of overtly Christianized along the way?
It's um, I think that's partly true. But there is this question of what is the relation between the monastic tradition on the one hand and the whole idea of the holy knights, the holy warriors, which are there. Those are kind of two um, different, perhaps sometimes competing aspects of Christendom. And remember that in the medieval times, power is secular power is ultimately derived from the religious source, is ultimately derived from the church and from the power of the Pope. This then becomes a later point of contention. And even though we have a monastic apparatus, we have the figure, the hermetic, the Hermes, the hermit figure of Trevisen. Even though we have reference to the Grail Knights as well, nevertheless, the Grail itself is ambiguous in its
Mm.
status and its relation to usual ecclesiastical authority of the church.
Mm. Well, I mean, that's part of the mystery is that the Grail appears in different forms in the different stories. In one story, it's a platter. In one, it's a cup. I think in another story, it appears as a lance.
Yeah,
And then in Wolfram's version, it's a stone,
that's right.
which resonates with the alchemy, which probably
Yeah,
intrigued Jung, who was
that
fascinated by alchemy. And,
and
and
that
also saw alchemy as like a link, right, from the pagan to the Christian era. I think that's what, like, at the core of his fascination with alchemy is, like you said, he likes to find these links. And I think, is that right? Is that what he saw alchemy as a link to, like, between the pagan and the Christian?
yeah.
Mhm.
It's a very good question. Where did Jung's interest in alchemy come from? Because I think it sits in relation to what he's doing in the Red Book, which the work on which he finally breaks off in 1928 when Richard Wilhelm sends him a copy of the Secret of Golden Flower, and that's when then Jung operates this shift away from working on the Red Book um, and if you like, working with the theoretical paradigms that informed and came out of the Red Book. So I'm thinking of Transformations and Symbols of Libido as a theoretical work that comes before the Red Book, Psychological Types of 1921 as a big theoretical statement which comes out of it. And what I think he's interested in alchemy is, again, this point about intellectual historical continuity. I think he's also interested in the key idea, which is there behind alchemy, and which I've tried to use as the thematic core to link all the 4 books in the series for Chiron together. And this is the idea of transformation. And Jung is fascinated, I think, by this idea of transformation. Obviously, he has undergone transformative experiences, either in a literal way or in a aesthetic, intellectual way. It doesn't matter, it's an experience, whatever its source is. And those, as we know from the Red Book, are profoundly transformational. And I think he's therefore attracted to traditions and to thought systems which elaborate this idea of transformation. And because the alchemical tradition is so massive, it's therefore not surprising that we can find in Parzifal alchemical references. Jung is very hot on the point that in Goethe's Faust we find alchemical allusions. You can also find alchemical vocabulary if you look for it in Nietzsche's Zarathustra. And I think the point about this is not that these guys were kind of closet hardcore alchemists. That's not the point, but rather all of them are interested in this idea of transformation, and it's only natural, therefore, that you will use the images and thought structures that come from a tradition like alchemy, which has the idea of transformation at its core.
So do you think that Wolfram was intentionally putting in these symbols? Because there's a lot of numerical symbols throughout the book, a lot of 4s and 10s, these numbers that represent wholeness and totality and completeness. It kind of, you think he was intentionally putting those in there for some reason?
I think it's part of this kind of multi-layered approach that one finds in Wolfram, and that's what I meant by what I said about it being very, very complex. So, is that you have different layers of images, different the numerical, the references to perfumes, the references
peacock feathers,
all that. So you've got different kinds of symbols that are in there. And including some which I think are, as far as I know, original to him, or original to him in his treatment of them. There's the moment when Parzifal is transfixed by the sight of blood on the snow. And we find this in Chrétien too, but there are subtle but important differences between the way that we find this in Chrétien and what happens with Parzifal, because Parzifal has kind of been triggered by the sight of the blood here, and whilst the idea of blood red and white as kind of symbols of erotic symbols of purity, if that's not too much of a contradiction, that's certainly part of the tradition that Wolfram would know about, but the degree of triggeredness, if you like, the degree of vision experience that the Parzival is experienced there is much more emphasized in Wolfram's version. So that's a good example of how something which is, you might call, a kind of natural image is given a particular spin by Wolfram in his treatment of it, and it's absolutely beautifully described.
Yeah, I mean, it's common, like in terms of the storyline, it's a bit of a non sequitur. There's just a moment where Parzifal is enthralled by these 3 drops of blood on snow, and he falls into this trance thinking about his wife, right?
That's right. Yeah,
and even someone comes along and tries to shake him out of it.
Yes, Gawain is trying to, yes, right. Get
and eventually Gawain, I think, has to like drop a handkerchief over the
right.
the blood to break the spell.
That's
I mean, there's there's a reason why Wolfram put that in there and gave it so much detail. What do you think he's trying to communicate there?
I I think it's to do with this sense of visionary experience. What we're not told what Parzifal is thinking in this experience, and in as much as he's purely a literary character, that there is nothing for him to be thinking. But obviously, within the narrative framework, you have got a character, you have got them having a visionary experience and thinking, and I think it ties in to other thematic threads which are there. First of all, the idea of blood in the sense of a bloodline and blood connection, because there are some extraordinary genealogical links which are there in Wolfram's world. Everybody seems to be related to almost everybody else in one way or another. So you've got the blood connection there. You've also, of course, got this idea in Catholic theological terms of the idea of the redeeming blood of Christ. And so, just as the Grail is a kind of parallel to, I'm not sure that it's an opposition to, but it's a parallel to the Catholic idea of the Mass. So here we have the Parzifal, if you like, being redeemed by the thought of love, but that's the blood on the snow and not the blood in the chalice which the priest offers you in communion.
Hmm. Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Is it possible? I know it's a big ask. It's a very complex story, but is there a way to give a summary of like the major plot points? And I'm thinking here of the plot points that relate most directly to Joseph Campbell's idea of the monomyth or the hero's journey, because at its kind of base level, this is a story that matches that pattern, right? Which I think of as an archetype of initiation or transformation itself, like with the descent and the return and all of that. I wonder, is that too much to ask of you to give a kind of a tight summary?
It's I'll do my best. It's a difficult one because it is again so extraordinarily complex. But again, we should be used to this. It's Parzifal is it's a bit like Star Wars with all the sequels and prequels packaged
Yeah,
in
right.
from the
There's all these subplots and side stories and side adventures and everything. But yeah, you know what I'm thinking of, like the kind of the main arc of Percival in
that's right.
the
That's
story.
right. I mean, it's worthwhile just to kind of give an example of that complexity to say that the story begins not with Parzifal himself, but with his parents.
Mhm.
So we have the kind of the fact of the family background that's
It's like the
there.
prequel to Star Wars. Like,
Exactly.
how did we
That's
get
right.
here?
That's right. And at least that's put sequentially at the beginning. It's not like Homer's Odyssey where you get
Kind of
narration later on
retroactive
of
thing.
things that have happened prior and so on. But it is worth bearing in mind the fact that those I mean I love these diagrams of the hero myth and so on. But it's I think always worth making the point of that those are they are so successful as diagrams because they simplify so radically. But I think they're useful because once you've got the sense of this is the overarching
Mhm.
the storyline, then it can make sense of these prequels and sequels.
Right, and you can then get into all the connective tissue and everything else,
That's right.
right? Yeah,
That's right.
all the
That's
arteries that come off the main story. But just to
that's
have that main through line, I think, yeah, is helpful.
that's right. And of course, the story opens. I'll come to the kind of the greatest bit in a moment. But you start off with this idea of an image, the symbolism of light and dark. And that, if you like, is a kind of governing idea which is throughout the story, and which is instantiated in a very, very literal way in the form of the half-brother, the Parzifal has, who is Firefits, who is the son of his father, Gamoret, with the Black Queen of Belakane, and in an example of imagery which is entirely unwoke, we have a child who is both black and white.
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
a good example of how, on a very literal level, we're presented with something which is essentially thematic.
Yeah, it's very curious because he's not like a mocha colored mulatto. He's actually, like Campbell describes him as piebald, like a pinto, like, so it's kind of spotty, and the black and the white are separate still.
That's right. And he's described as being black and white, like a magpie and so on. But it's obvious that and I think Wolfram in his treatment of other cultures is in fact much more open and welcoming than many other medieval epic writers tend to be. It's clear that he's using this as a way of instantiating this theme of light and dark, which is also then related to the cognate theme of good and evil, good and bad. And this relates then to the question which is, I think, at the heart of the story, who is God? And that is advanced very, very early on when moving into the plot of the main part of Parsifal. We have Parsifal, who is living alone in the forest with his mother, Herzeloid, who is the second wife of Gamoret. And he leaves her a second time. So Gamoret has lots of relationship issues, which again form a whole subplot of their own. But we have Parsifal as a child, grown up with Herzeloid in the forest, and symbolically, therefore, away from the world of the court. And yet, you can't entirely escape that world of the court, because he sees the three knights that are coming through the forest one day, and he's fascinated by these figures. But Herzeloid doesn't want Parsifal to get caught up with the world of the court. So again, we already have a sort of country-town divide, which is operating here on a literal in terms of the narrative, and as well on a symbolic level. And so she tries to dissuade Parsifal from going off and following the knights, and at the same time, she also tries to answer the question that Parsifal puts to her: "Was ist Gott?" What is God? And she advances a theology which is that God is purely love, purely light. Okay? There are biblical texts which are fully aligned with this view, but that's happening on one level. On the other level, in order to stop Parsifal going off to the court, she dresses him up in a kind of ridiculous clothing to prevent him being fit for the court, as it were. And this is the great theme of Parzifal as being tump, as the medieval German has it, tump, so stupid or foolish. And yet, of course, it is the fool who is going to achieve the greater wisdom than all of the clever ones put together.
Right.
Can
we take a little pause here?
Sure.
So a couple things to note. I mean, the role of the mother here is really interesting. Like, she is a kind of smothering, devouring mother type who wants to protect her son from the world. He doesn't even know his real name. She just calls him the good boy, the dear boy.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. and of course wants to protect him, so dresses him up like this country bumpkin so that no one will take him seriously before he ventures out, right?
Exactly right. Yes. Yeah. I don't. I mean, from a psychoanalytical or psychological point of view, tons and tons of material here. And there's also the very strange dream that she has about a dragon that is going to come and devour it. So
Mm.
it's absolutely packed full of psychological material. There is a reason why psychoanalysis was first formulated by German
Mm.
speakers, Freud and Jung.
Yeah, and I think also maybe probably, I mean, probably something else that like really intrigued Jung about this story was that like in terms of his typology, is that Parzival starts out in a very kind of natural state. He's naive, but there's a natural intelligence in him. There's you know, his instincts are very much alive and guiding him. He's very spontaneous. So he's kind of like displaying that kind of like undeveloped essence, you know, of youth and
Yeah.
the natural world versus the civilized and that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
That's right. Yes, no, that's right. And it's extraordinary. You know, we have this kind of a patronizing view of the Middle Ages as being very crude and unsophisticated and so on. And as you'll see, I don't believe that's the case. That's the case at all. And even in the Middle Ages, you've got this idea of things are too modern, things are not as good as they were in the past. You have this idea of a wish for paradise.
Mm.
A word which is significantly connected with the Grail at one point, and it's anything other than uh, uh, unreflective on itself. It fully realizes, I think, its own historicity, and in that respect, in some ways, it can teach us a lesson because there may be kind of certain assumptions that we make that because they are assumptions, we don't recognize that they're there, we don't challenge them, therefore.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, right? Like, so even in this kind of fledgling version of Western civilization, there was still a kind of nostalgia for the simpler times.
I think that's absolutely right, and in a sense, that's always there. That people have always looked back in the past. I think in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a line about this, which is saying, you should never always say it was so much better in the past because it wasn't. And I guess if anything, if the Christian story or the Judeo-Christian story of the fall means anything, it's kind of well paradise is something which is purely notional. As far as history is concerned, it's always been extremely tough.
Yeah, but I can't help it but think about like that this is part of like the Christian dogma or whatever like maybe Christian thought implanted in the Western mind is this thought of linearity and forward moving progress.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, that's where it all goes wrong. Is this idea of linearity, and I suppose in a lot of courtly literature and in Wolfram's Parzifal as well, you both have the circularity. You both are referring back to the past, and there are certain episodes, certain episodic moments which recur. For
Mhm.
example, he keeps on meeting uh, uh, the, the lady of the lady of the court and her husband who dies, who eventually reveals his name to him. And but you also have a trajectory, a development as well, which is Parzifal sees the Grail, doesn't understand what it is, and says what he ought to, then has to try and make that right, and in the end, it does, and everything does come together in the end.
Yeah, he
And I
gets a
think it's
second
this
chance.
mixture of circularity and linearity that makes it such a fascinating book.
Yeah, totally. Okay, can you pick up the story? He's heading out. He's been dressed up like a fool by his mother, and
So
he's become fascinated by these knights that he's seen. He's like, whoa.
that's right. Um, uh, we have various scenes of him engaging in knightly combat, including with one figure who is the Red Knight. and a very popular figure of the court. Everybody's distraught at the court when it turns out that Parzifal has fought the Red Knight and killed him, and dresses himself up in the Red Knight's clothes. This is all very, very interesting for the Steinerians and so on. Is this idea of different stages of life, different stages of maturation are represented through the different plot stages, if you like, as we go through Parsifal. And just as he's been given advice about how to deal with women by his mother, Herzeloid, so he's also given advice on how he should conduct himself in the world by the knightly figure of Gurnemanz. And it's Gurnemanz who tells the Parsifal, you shouldn't be too quick to ask a question. Mm. And that's the fateful advice, because Parsifal takes this as being, well, you shouldn't ask questions. Mm. And it's interesting how it's such a sort of textual crux. What does Gurnemanz actually say to him? Is it forbidding him from asking a question, or is it you simply shouldn't pester people with questions? And you've got a similar kind of textual crux in Goethe's Faust with the terms of the wager that Faust strikes with Fisto, and the question at the end of part 2. Well, Faust says words which are very, very close to the ones of the wager, but they're not quite identical. It's fascinating to see how these kind of little textual details can inflect our whole interpretations of these words. At any rate, when he's given this advice by Gurnemanz, he remembers it and he takes it with him when he encounters the Fisher King, Amfortas, who is there fishing, as you'd expect the Fisher King to do, who advises him to seek lodging for the night at the castle of Munsalveshe. So you've got the idea of the Mount of Salvation. And that's where Parsifal sees for the first time the whole ritual of the Grail, Réponse de Choix. And again, significant name. You've got the idea of bountiful joy associated with this figure. Is carrying in the Grail in a ceremony which looks very much like the one that Chrétien describes, but there are important little differences of detail. The lance is important in Chrétien, not so important in Wolfram. And the Grail provides food and drink for everybody. So again, we have this idea of the Grail as a powerful source of sustaining life.
I mean, I don't know if you point this out in your book or not, but this Grail feeding everyone, you reach out your hand to the Grail and whatever you desire will be given to you. I mean, that's a very Christ-like image, right? The loaves and the fishes, the wine at the wedding.
Yeah, that's right. And there's so many varieties of this, of whether the Grail gives literal food and drink. There are some versions where the Grail is described as sort of moving around, giving them meat and drink. There's one version where it's tons and tons of hogs' heads that it's providing. So you've got a very materialist reading of the Grail as a kind of eat as much as you like buffet kind of thing. But then down to what we find in Chrétien and what we find in Wolfram, which is the Grail certainly feeding everybody here, but it's feeding them in this castle, which is the Mount of Salvation. And it's not a great big feast, but it is, as you say, it's like the image of the bread and the fishes. It is food as sustaining life, along with a symbolic dimension that is part and parcel of those ingredients, if you like, as well. And in addition to its kind of courtly feeding function, there is this linked there to the image of the dove coming down on Good Friday with the host at its beak, and it's that host from the Grail which is going to be able to redeem the Fisher King from this terrible affliction that he had.
Hmm.
And that is the question that Parzifal fails to ask when he's there in the Grail castle, is to ask Amfortas, what ails thee? What is wrong with thee? Why are you ill? That's the question that he doesn't ask. And that is, as it were, his great calamitous act, or his great calamitous non-act. It's a sin of omission rather than commission. He should have spoken, and he doesn't. But of course, you need that moment of catastrophe in order to kickstart the next arc of the story, which is going to be him trying to find the Grail castle a second time, having other adventures. You've got the plot line which comes in of the other night, Gawain. That then takes up many chapters of his knightly exploits, his love affairs as well. And then in the end, these two storylines merge back at the court. And there's another fight scene between Parzifal and a knight who turns out to be his half-brother Hierophilus. So these two lines come back together at an end. Hierophilus is looking for his father. Of course, he won't find him, he's dead, but he does find his half-brother. And then Hierophilus is unable to see the Grail, which Parzifal is for a second time successful in identifying. It turns out that Parzifal, far from simply being Tump, simply being this foolish, clownish figure, is in fact destined to be the Grail King. He only knows that, of course, through this whole series of adventures that he goes through. And then in the final scene, Parzifal goes to the Grail castle. He asks the question, which is able to free Amfortas from his suffering. Hierophilus falls in love with Réponse de Choix. He converts to Christianity so that he can marry her, but also see the writing that appears on the Grail. And a new story arc finally opens up at the end, which is Parzifal's son, Lohengrin, another epic, and another Wagner opera, if you like, as well. It's complex, isn't it?
It's complex, and there's a lot that's in there that kind of just skip over. So I want to maybe circle back and look at some of the main symbolism throughout the story here. So there is something that I find really intriguing, based mostly on a conversation I had with a kind of anthroposophist healer, who's very influenced by Steiner, obviously. But he talked a lot about his way of healing was finding the middle point. And he talked about this as the Christ point. And so then reading analysis of Parzifal, even his name, Parzival, being this pierce through.
Yeah.
So there is this theme of the middle way. And you had talked earlier about the theme of the black and the white. And could you expand on that a little bit, how this shows up in the story and what its implications are?
Sure. Well, I think one good example of that kind of imagery might be this idea of footsteps and traces, because it happens several times that the Parzifal is trying to find his way. And initially, on one level, he's trying to find his way to the court. So he's trying to find his way to social acceptance, to moving from the countryside to the town, from moving from nature to culture to civilization. But the way that he does that, and this whole misadventure with the Grail, opens up a greater destiny, which is not simply that he's going to join Arthur's court and become just yet another knight, as it were, but rather he's going to become a pivotal figure, through this status that he has of being related to the Grail King, and this being a title position which is going to be bestowed on him at the end. So I think you would find through that narrative arc, both this sense of, well, how do you succeed in life in an ordinary and everyday sense, but also the sense of how do you succeed in a more symbolic or more mystical or more spiritual, in a different, richer kind of sense, because that's obviously related to as one of the core aspects of the Grail is, okay, on one level it's a kind of feeding machine, but on another level it's providing a food which is a spiritual sustenance. And so Parzifal succeeds both in the real world and, if you like, in the spiritual one, through this double success that he has, this double destiny which he realizes by being a member of the court, but by being also the keeper of the Grail as well.
Mm-hmm. There's also something there too, I think, about like when he first gets the advice, knights don't ask questions, which I read as like this knight saying, like, kind of keep your cards close to your chest for a while, kind of suss out the situation before you give too much away about what you don't know. So it's kind of like a bit of a power move. But of course, like Percival, he's this naive fool, so he just takes it on completely literally and totally. Don't ask questions. And so I wonder if there's something there about the middle way of like getting out of kind of black and white thinking and trying to do what's appropriate in the moment. I think that's a lesson that he learns. It's like, if you're curious about what's going on with someone, like they're obviously ailing, well, the chivalrous thing to do, the compassionate thing to do, is to ask, like, what ails thee?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And we can see things, and that's again perhaps the artistic genius of Wolfram is that we are able to see things, and which the character Parzifal at certain moments is unable to see. And I think that's one of kind of the great one of the characteristics of great writing is that you have this. I'm thinking of something like Flaubert's Madame Bovary, where you have this wonderful. You can both see how the character is going to interpret things, but also over and above it, the narrator opens to us a kind of interpretive space which is not available to the character. And I think there's one of the things that's often underestimated or underappreciated in these works, but I think you've absolutely put your finger on it, which is that there is a certain irony as well at work. And so when Gurnemanz gives this advice to Parzifal, we can see what Gurnemanz is getting at, but we can also see how Parzifal, with his lack of social context, is again going to get it wrong. But of course, he has to get it wrong in order to then get it right further on. And of course, that's what the monomyth, that's what the heroic circle, it always has to incorporate at some level, is there has to be the mistake, there has to be the trespass, there has to be the sin, there has to be the descent, there has to be the catabasis, in order for there to be salvation, redemption, restoration, moving up and moving onward. That's written into our, as it were, the DNA of how we think about development, and we can see that at work in Wolfram's Parzifal. But it's also, I think, you're absolutely right, it's at work in a knowing way, and that's one of the things that makes Wolfram's Parzifal a very modern text, with all the caveats that go around it.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something there too about like it being like kind of genius storytelling. Like if I find myself speaking to the character in the story, like going, Parzifal, just ask the question, you're really engaged in the story at that point, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And it's again the kind of genius of Wolfram because we talked a little bit about the historical background, the cultural background, so very different from ours today, and yet in terms of psychological acumen, in terms of giving us characters that we can intellectually understand, but also emotionally engage with, tremendously powerful as a writer as well. I can absolutely see why someone like Steiner will be able to find patterns and structures at work in Wolfram's text, which can then be systematized into, this is about different stages of development that we go through, including a mystical dimension, because that's obviously, as it were, baked into the idea of the Grail itself. It's both ein Ding in Middle High German, it's both a thing, it's physical, it's material, and it obviously it transcends that very physicality and materiality through this spiritual, this mystical function that it has as well.
Right. And also Parzifal's transformation is both like social, secular, and spiritual. Like, so, part of that monomyth is meeting the mentors, or meeting the guides. And so he meets 4 masculine figures along the way and 4 feminine figures along the way.
Yeah.
And I think in both cases, there like 2 of the masculine figures kind of instruct him on like social matters, and 2 kind of give him a spiritual initiation. Which is, again, there's the levels at work there, which I think was intriguing to Steiner, of course.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And one of those male advisory figures we've talked about, Gurnemann. The other one is the hermit Trevritzend, and Trevritzend tells Parzifal about the Grail, this almost kind of Gnostic narrative about the fallen angels, and it's interesting to think, we have both, in order to understand Parzifal, we have to understand, Orthodox Christian ideas, but those Orthodox Christian ideas are also the basis then of some very strange theology and very, very unorthodox theologies we find with Trevritzend, relating the Grail to this idea of the fallen angels, in an entirely non-biblical biblical way, but by linking the Grail to this quasi-Gnostic myth is another way of signaling that the Grail is a parallel to a Christian outlook, but it cannot ultimately be identified with it. And Trevritzend, I think, is very important, because built into this idea, why you're talking about fallen angels, is because you're also trying to describe the fact that the divine is not simply about lights. Whatever one reads in the first letter of John, and whatever Herzl would have told Parzifal, but there is clearly, where we have the suffering of Amfortas, terrible suffering, awful suffering. He's described in the beginning of one book as shrieking out in pain. His wound that he has is stinking. They have to fumigate him. They have to open the windows because this wound is so foul and noxious. So you've certainly got a world of suffering, and Parzifal is trying to understand, well, what is God that allows this suffering? And at one point, there's a very powerful passage where he renounces God and he turns against him. Again, you think, well, this is a profoundly unorthodox gesture. It's almost heretical, but it makes sense psychologically for Parzifal to do this. And then at the end, he's able, as it were, to take back that renunciation, affirm his faith in God, whom he understands is both light and dark, just as his half brother Hierophete is light and dark as well. And so ultimately, Hierophete is another one of those, is on the physical level of what his skin tone is meshing in with this larger theme of light and dark, good and evil. So absolutely key fundamental ideas. of course, for Jung, we think about Answer to Job in the 1950s. This whole question of the problem of evil is really going to weigh down on Jung's mind as well, and is already there in Wolfram too, in an extraordinarily open and knowing way.
Yeah, like Parzifal's renunciation of God makes it more meaningful when he then consciously converts or accepts God.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And of course, what he has to do is overcome this false, in the sense of simplistic notion that he has that he has inherited, and yet it's a simplistic notion which we might feel is still around today. You know that it's in many ways a very kind of touchy feely kind of version of Christianity, that it's
God
given.
is good.
That's like good, it's happy clappy. If you pray, he'll show you a parking space and so on. That kind of very very naive approach has to be overcome, has to be around in order to get a more theologically nuanced, psychologically insightful view of what God means. And so I think it makes sense as part of his development to see, not simply in a mechanical way that he renounces and then that is later ordered to believe, but he's working through, that might be the way to describe this false belief, and the adventures that he had, the Aventura, this very medieval idea of a pattern with which you're going to engage, a series of significant events that are going to be transformative for you. These Aventura on which he embarks are part and parcel of that working through, which is presented in a symbolic way in this symbolic universe that we've talked about with alchemical and other references, that brings alive this idea of working through something and makes it tangible and comprehensible, particularly emotionally comprehensible.
Yeah, like the struggle has to happen consciously for it to mean anything, and for it to be, I don't know, like true or something. Like, yeah, that's.
It's not a knowledge that simply falls out of nowhere.
Yeah,
it's something which has to be won,
wrestled
like
with
the Grail itself. You don't just say, "Oh, I'd rather like the Grail." It's got to be worked.
Yeah, and that allows for this kind of true metanoia, the change of heart that happens.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, which is like the kind of the inner conversion, the true conversion or something. Let's talk a little bit about the theme of wounding in this, because like you said, Amphorus is wounded in the thigh or in the groin, and so he's suffering, but of course, like the whole kingdom is suffering. The kingdom around him has become like a wasteland, and there's a direct connection between the wounded king and the infertility of the land. Can you open that up a little? Open that wound up a little? Excuse the pun.
Oh yes, I'm not going anywhere near that wound. It's a terrible thing. But no, you're right. That's one of the most powerful aspects of the story. One of the aspects which, of course, interested T.S. Eliot in the Wasteland, and T.S. Eliot's Wasteland is a wonderful example of a modernist text, but with this absolutely in line with this medieval story, which assumes that it's going to be it's going to be understood in order to see with the way that that Eliot has modified it. And I think what you're rightly drawing attention to here is the fact that these problems, these adventures, these workings through are both individual and collective. And the fact that it is not simply the Fisher King who suffers, but his kingdom, which is suffering, which becomes a wasteland as well, is a good example of the way that the medieval mind sees the individual and the collective as almost being identical, as being very much interwoven. And I think that represents a mentality which is perhaps one of the most difficult for us, given the modern emphasis on the individual, to understand. This sense that if an individual does something wrong, then the community will suffer, and that's just the way it is. And the thing to do is not complain about, well, why should the collectivity have to suffer for what an individual does? The question that Wolfram's putting, I think, is and the tradition of the Grail is putting is, don't worry about that. It's how do you redeem the individual and therefore redeem society as well? That's the whole focus. I think our modern focus would be, well, hang on, that's not fair. Why should people suffer for the sin of others? And that is profoundly difficult for us to accept. I think that there is a different mentality that will see the individual and the collective as, thinking of that old motif of as above, so below. That it's another kind of connecting unity, a kind of vertical one, if you like, and that's. And you don't question that, because that's simply the way it is. Rather, the whole of the effort has to be, how do you restore health to the wasteland? How do you stop the suffering of Amphibs? And in a way, Parzival's failure to ask the question is a failure to understand that connectivity between society and the individual.
Yeah. Often what I have to do is kind of try to put myself back in a pre-rational mindset to understand some of these stories, because like before rationalism took over, in a pre-psychological age, people, I think, just had a more symbolic mind. So there was no kind of interpretation needed to see the king as a representation of the kingdom, and his health is completely interwoven with that of the kingdom, etc. It's just the way people saw things. And I think that's a massive leap for us to take from this kind of modern mind to the more mythic mind, is one of the ways I think of it.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the only thing I'd take issue with is this question of it. It's not so much pre-rational as it's a different kind of rationality.
Sure. Yeah.
And,
I meant
and
like
that's
that
not to
modern
minimize.
sense.
Yeah, that's not to minimize the difficulties that we that we have with it, because I think that tends to be our, that be anyone's automatic responses. We're brought up eye for eye, tooth for tooth. There is, there's a proportionality there. That's simply absent in this in this worldview, because I think it takes seriously the fact that there is suffering, and there is darkness, and there is evil, and that and of course those are things which rationality has huge difficulty coping with as well. Think of a supremely rational thinker like Kant is going to have huge difficulties with the idea that there can be sin and there can be evil. That's really not going to fit with his rational scheme, which is the one I think de facto we would say has prevailed in modernity. And it takes someone like Hegel who will dare to try and adapt Kantian ideas to explain, well, there has to be suffering because that's the progress of Geist going through the world, and of course we find Hegel very difficult to accept. Now, Hegel's view that suffering is necessary because it's all part and parcel of progress. You don't get an omelette without breaking some eggs. And of course, I think we find this idea very, very difficult for obvious historical reasons in the 20th century and in the 21st century, when everything that terrible that happened in the 20th century, to advance a view of history that says all the suffering that happened then was necessary and is rational because the Geist is rational. That is, I think, even for hardcore Hegelians, a difficult argument to accept with equanimity.
I mean, I go back to Heraclitus with this, that strife is the father of all things. Um, like if everything's good, then nothing is good. It becomes meaningless, right?
That's absolutely right. Of course, by in the case of Heraclitus, um, you might want to balance that with other pre-Socratic approaches. What I think what I think is characteristic of all of them is that they don't put that argument in moral terms. Heraclitus
Mhm.
does not put that argument in moral terms. It's kind of strife is the father of all things, war is the father of all things. That's just how it is. And
Mhm.
it's a very modern concern to frame it as a moral question in that way. But I don't think we would say we want to have less morality. Rather, it's we have the framework. It's just that we're unable to meet the challenge of it in our current situation.
Mm. Yeah, we could kind of develop our morality and revise it at times and all of that, right? But yeah. Um, so there, okay, so there's the wound. What do you think? I think T.S. Eliot kind of took on the view that the story of Parsifal and the wounded Fisher King, the wasteland, was a kind of how did they put it? Like a pagan fertility rite that had kind of found or been brought along into the Christian age, and so there's this kind of like mix there. What do you
That's
think
right.
about that
Yeah.
theory?
That well, a lot of that comes from Jesse L. Weston, comes from Fraser, The Golden Bough, and so on. And I mean, they're quite compelling ideas, partly because they seek to establish a continuity,
Mm.
but I think a good example would be, for example, the case of the Green Man. Um, uh, there was a figure that was identified by anthropologists in the early 20th century as being a kind of pagan hangover. Um, but in fact, I think the most recent idea of it is that no, these figures, as green men were, have practically been invented. That they're not pagan in their origin at all. But we're so fixated on the idea of there being some kind of possibility of a revival of paganism that we allow that to temper our ideas. And that's why there's so many pubs which are called the Green Man and so on, because there was this big thing about discovering the Green Man in your locality. So it was almost a kind of advertising idea. I think go down the pub and get into your pagan self. But at the same time, there is something something very profound about it, which is to say that pre-Christian traditions um, did not die out when Christianity spread, but rather they fused and were
Mm. Syncretized.
amalgamated and
Mm.
incorporated. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I never heard this idea about the Green Man being a more kind of modern invention.
yeah,
Uh,
that's right. Yes, yeah.
it was just kind of an advertising thing or a kind of I don't know, like a folk idea. Like,
well, the folklorish movement in the late 19th century in England was very big.
mm,
Um, of course, it was also very big and with very problematic ideological overtones in Germany as well. And of course, the the idea of there being a revival of paganism, if we look at German history in the 20th century, is a very alarming idea.
mm,
If we think about the National Socialist appropriation of ideas of folklore, I mean the whole idea
mm,
of the folk is ideologically tinged, ideologically tainted in a way which isn't the case with folklore, where we maybe associate it more with Morris dancing and more comfortable things like that.
mm,
Um, but I think the example of the Green Man also shows um, you know people who are academics and scholars often want something to be the case so they can make a name with it. And there are a lot of drivers behind people saying, oh well, this is the latest idea that I've got. This is what I'm going to drive and make my big contribution to the field of anthropology, is because there is a lot of motivation for people to do that, or even simply in a harmless way. That however scholarly you want to be, it's very often difficult to get out of the parti pris of the mindset that you go into your work. And that's probably a kind of useful reminder to all of us to check our own kind of assumptions and interrogate them as often as we
can. Okay, maybe some of the other symbolism here. Well, actually, no, let's talk about those questions, because that's very intriguing. So isn't it in Chrétien's version and Wolfram's version, the question is different in I can't remember which, but in one of them, the question he's supposed to ask is what ails thee. In another one, it's whom does the Grail serve?
Whom does the Grail serve? That's right. Chrétien is whom does the Grail serve, and it's what ails thee in the front. That's right.
Well, and then you bring in Jung's question about being related to the infinite as a kind of like central question to Jung. Can you talk about that? Because you see those questions as all being related in some way, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, as you pointed out, again, there is another kind of textual crux around. Okay, Parzifal's got to ask the question, but what is the question that he's meant to be asking? And the Chrétien version, whom does the Grail serve? You could see as being different from what ails thee, or one could see it as, it's a different formulation of it. Again, lots of different interpretive possibilities which are there, which have different consequences for your understanding of the story. But I think one way of seeing a common link between those two questions is to see them as different articulations of Jung's question, which is, I related to something larger than yourself. I related to the infinite. I related to the infinite within you. And Jung puts that in Memories, Dreams, Reflections as being a kind of a core question for modern, postmodern individuals to ask themselves: do we have something which connects us to the cosmos? It's another way, of course, I suppose, of articulating the relation between the individual and the collective. So it ties up with what we were talking about a moment ago. And it's, I think, no coincidence that Jung, who says that he absolutely loved reading about the Grail when he was a child, maintained and retained this interest in the Grail legend, and has this remarkable dream, far more remarkable, I think, in some ways than the famous visions of the palace in the cellar downstairs and God on the roof of Basel Cathedral and so on. An absolutely fascinating dream where he finds himself with some friends outside a castle, and realizes this is actually the castle of the Grail. And in his dream, there is a kind of academic, scholarly figure who is going on and on about the castle. And Jung wants to say, but hang on, this is really the Grail castle. And he cannot get the individual with a scholarly, very conventional scholarly mindset to see what is so important. And you can think, I mean, that's just a wonderful symbol, I think, of, in a way that Jung in the seminar room is so useful, that he's really wanting people to connect with, the larger worldview, and ultimately the sense of being part of a cosmos. And then the dream changes, and he and his friends are by the coast. And he realizes that, in fact, they're all going to fall asleep, and the only person who can go and get the Grail in order to bring it back to the castle is going to be him. And he takes off his clothes and about to get into the water, and the dream comes to an end. And it's an immensely powerful account that he gives in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And again, I think the point is not, well, did the dream happen in the form that he remembers it? Well, who could ever say anything about it? but reading it as a kind of modern instantiation of the Grail legend in a very, very short and compressed form, it's absolutely stunning. It's absolutely beautiful, because it is about the responsibility of the individual to have insight, to try and communicate that to others, even if others aren't going to be able to, aren't prepared to listen to them or unable to understand what they're saying. And then finally, to assume responsibility themselves for saving what is important. And in this case, that's represented by taking the Grail back to the castle. And typically, of course, what that would mean is something which is beyond representation. And so, of course, Jung has to wake up and his dream comes to an end. But it seems to me that it's kind of like a little Grail legend in just one or two pages of memories, dreams, reflections. But we might say the whole message of the Grail for us today is there.
Coming into consciousness, trying to open up people's eyes to the deeper meaning of things, and doing what you can to preserve what is sacred.
Absolutely. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, one could look at that dream and say, well, this is obviously an example of Jung's grandiosity and his sense of inflation, of seeing himself as a kind of savior figure of humanity. And, you know, some people also see him that way.
That's absolutely right. And of course, I think that's, you know, we're rightly worried about people who go around seeing as savior figures.
Who go around and say things like, I don't believe in God, I know God.
Well, exactly. Well, the strange thing about view is he says, yes, he says, he says it's subtly different, but I think significantly the question that's put to him by John Freeman, he says, do you believe in God? And Jung, and what Jung actually says is, he says, I don't need to believe, I know. He doesn't say what he knows. I think is one of the most brilliant formulations, and that Jung is too clever and too canny not to have known what he was doing. So in a way, it's a kind of a confession of a gnosis in the most general sense of the word, rather than him saying that he knows God. And that's why Jung is always enjoying conversations where he equivocates with theologians by saying, no, it's a psychological idea, and then equivocates with psychologists by saying, no, it's more than just an idea. He's very clever, very, very difficult. I think.
Well, he had the twinkle in his eye when he gave that answer, right? And I mean,
even that's absolutely true.
Even thinking about how he defined God as that thing that kind of interrupts his plans, you know, his kind of egoic agendas. So even that is like, it's a mysterious force that's outside of oneself and that can act upon the individual.
I think that's right. And of course, in a way, that whole problem is anticipated by Wolfram, because Parzifal might have this destiny to become the Lord of the Grail, but he does start off, as you said, as you described him, as the country bumpkin. He does start off as Tum and so on. So there is a possible kind of irony in this trajectory as well. In fact, I'm convinced that understanding irony in literature is the biggest problem that we have, because so often we don't see it, and we often don't see it, I think, in translation. But I think it's a good case in point that you can read Goethe or you can read Thomas Mann in English, and it looks remarkably straightforward. But then you read it in the original German, and a whole ironic dimension emerges, which is it's impossible to capture fully, or if at all, in English. And I do wonder if there is an ironic dimension, which perhaps not always Jung, and perhaps very rarely Steiner actually get a hold of. And the whole point about that irony is not to undermine what you're saying. You know, an irony has to have both a belief in the importance of something and a certain kind of necessary skepticism, or, as you so beautifully put it, a twinkle in the eye, and so on. but the Twinkle and I appreciates what it's being ironic about. It's
Hmm.
not simply putting the boot in. And I think it shows a kind of a mental space or a kind of mental elasticity. And I'm convinced that that's there in Wolfram as well. And it's because he takes it seriously that he opens up an element of humor or the possibility of a joke about it. You can only joke about what you take seriously.
Hmm. Yeah, there's something there that I find really interesting. Like that, let me see if I can tease this out. So there's something about Parzifal being this kind of idiot savant. Like even when he encounters these knights early on and defeats them, he has no training in fighting. He's just kind of good at it or
Yeah,
successful in some way by some element of chance or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Is there something in that about like, I don't know, what keeps coming up to mind is like a kind of Zen idea about beginner's mind or a kind of attitude of humility, not being kind of overcome with this heroic inflation,
Mm.
to always, retain the element of the simple and the natural, like even like those kind of old clothes that he wears underneath his armor is like
Yeah.
keeping that close, like
Mm.
your humble origins close.
Mm. Mm.
I
Yes.
don't know.
No, I think that's a very shrewd observation. And I think that in a way, another example of this kind of irony is the keeping the old clothes on beneath the new shiny professional looking armor that you've acquired in someone. Keeping a sense of your background, your connections, remaining earthed in some sense. I think that's also at play as well. And it's worthwhile remembering that Arthur's court is not presented as being an entirely unproblematic place by any means either. There's an incident where somebody spills some drink over Queen Guinevere. There is a very aggressive knight who's sort of martial figure who intervenes and drags someone off by their hair. You have Kundry turning up the first time round, very very negative about Parzifal and his failure to ask the question.
Mhm.
Also very negative about Arthur's court as well. So it is quite interesting to reflect that well before Monty Python, people people are skeptical about the world of Arthur's court.
Right, kind of taking the piss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, I was happy to see you reference Peter Kingsley in the book, and I guess his catafalque work,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
talks about Jung, and I mean, it's a book I've read twice, and I don't know, it's a very strange and powerful, intriguing book. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but I find myself drawn to what he's talking about in there. Like he kind of puts Jung up as a prophet. Uh, I mean, why did you bring Kingsley's work into your book? What do you think he has to say about Parsifal and Jung?
Yeah. Well, I think that of the work that's being done on Jung at the moment, Peter Kingsley is some of the most important, and I think that's reflected in the depth of scholarship that's there in those two volumes. Um, Even if the citation style is somewhat idiosyncratic, it's evident. If once you've worked it out, it's fine. Um, but there is an immense depth of learning which is there in the second volume. I mean, I have to say as well that it's interesting these days when very often when writing for publishers or articles, you're told, oh, cut down on the footnotes, and we don't want any footnotes, and so on. And
Mm.
I've always had a sympathy for footnotes, and lo and behold, the second volume of Catafalque is purely footnotes. So I do admire the Schutzpart with which he's done that, as well as appreciating the depth of scholarship which has gone into the content of those footnotes. And the reason why I wanted to cite it was because I was reading at the same time that I was thinking about Parzifal. There is, and of course, I'm sure some people will find it problematic, the self-identification that Kingsley makes with the Grail Knight, this kind of visionary experience that he has when he's talking in Volume 1 about going off to Bollingen, but also because he draws attention to this fascinating letter of 1926, where Jung demonstrates his prophetic credentials, as far as, if I've understood him right, Peter Kingsley is concerned, understands his credentials by saying the worst thing that you can have to deal with is senseless suffering, and therefore we have to give meaning to suffering. And I think that as a sort of thematic reorientation and a different perspective that one can bring to looking at the Red Book, I think is immensely refreshing. And I learned a lot from it, and I appreciate it as a book which I think is very, very different from conventionally scholarly approaches. But Peter Kingsley is the exact opposite of that kind of professorial figure in Young's dream. The professor who isn't interested in talking about the Grail. Here's a professor who is interested in talking about the Grail.
Yeah, well, it's one of the things I love about Kingsley is that he is a renegade scholar and he is idiosyncratic. Like when you read his endnotes, it might be some kind of anecdotal thing that he's referencing or his own article. And so you have to wonder, okay, well, what's this theory actually based on other than his own idea? So maybe from a strictly scholarly point of view, his work can be quite questionable. But man, it is intriguing, and he does get interested in these kind of deeper mysteries. And I think like Jung, he is always looking for that kind of esoteric hidden thread running through Western civilization that ties all of these kind of disparate elements together, from its origins in Egyptian esotericism, then kind of Greek philosophy, and then Christianity, and this mix in there of like the Persian, the Middle Eastern, and the Celtic and the Germanic. I mean, it's kind of hard to work out like what is Western thought or what is the Western tradition. And I think like these stories, whether it's a kind of an esoteric story or a fable or epic like Parsifal, I think that's maybe why I'm so drawn back to it, is because it does give us a kind of a thread or a container to hold it all, or a framework in which to bring all of these things together.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I was intrigued by the way that Kingsley used the Grail motif. I mean, even if he does tend to go with Chrétien's version of the question, whom did the Grail serve, rather than the Wolfram question, but it indicates to me that he's got that part of that dream that Jung is talking about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and other aspects that are relevant to what we've been talking about. And someone like Wolfram von Eschenbach, or any writer, Goethe, Nietzsche, I don't believe that they sit down and say, I'm going to write the next step in the epic, the German epic of transformation. They write out of the immediate pressures, the inheritance that they have intellectually and culturally, and they produce something. And in some cases, it proves to be so complex and so wonderful that we can describe it as having a canonical status. I think that Wolfram, we can see his importance really only now in retrospect. And I think that's true, isn't it, of every artist, that it's terribly difficult at that moment in time when looking at contemporary art to understand what is significant and what is, say, less significant. It's only after so many centuries that with Wolfram von Eschenbach, as the time goes on, so his significance accrues, and so his relevance accrues as well. And if I have persuaded people through writing this book that they're going to be able to say, right, I really want to go and read Parzifal now, and you can find it in the Jesse Weston translation, absolutely free with no copyright problems online. You've got no excuse. There it is. Go and read it. That would be, I think, a very important thing of what I want to do, which is to invite people to discover Wolfram from Eschenbach, particularly Jungians, obviously, to discover or rediscover Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzifal, but also, I would hope, by engaging with these canonical texts, to suggest to people who are outside Jungian circles, well, maybe there is something that's sort of important to this guy Jung as well. And if those two audiences can mix and can meet, then I would be very happy.
And there's something like that makes me feel like the story, why I find it so intriguing, compelling, and continually return to it, is because it does provoke these questions that you can't resolve. And I think they're questions that one can wrestle with for a lifetime. Like, what is the Grail? First of all, just start to contemplate that. Like, what is the Grail? And then, whom does the Grail serve? I mean, incredible questions.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And there is a therapist called Gareth Knight. It's a great name to have, isn't it, in this context? Who's taken these Arthurian legends and taken Wolfram's Parzifal almost as a way of creating a kind of Wolframian therapy on its own. And again, without wishing to endorse the entirety of what he's saying, I think he's put his finger on something which is very important, which is the point that you have very powerfully just made, which is that these are tremendously powerful questions. They're very, very simple, but they have all kinds of associations, and they open up possibilities. And I think that Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzifal has a kind of status as a therapeutic text, if you like. This isn't about putting texts into boxes. It's about saying, as the centuries have gone on, perhaps it's acquired this and even more, because it is a link, if you like, in that golden chain. It is one of those elements of continuity. And if I've understood anything about Jung, then it's that seeing ourselves in terms of that continuity has tremendously beneficial, or if you want, therapeutic effects as well. And I could well understand how one could construct out of Parzifal a kind of do it yourself Grail therapy, if you like, from that it would be a fantastic exercise in the therapeutic use of art, and in this case the therapeutic use of a very rich and fascinating and complex text, which I think the more you engage with it, it doesn't let go of you, and it doesn't leave you untouched, and it doesn't leave you, well, entirely untransformed. It works its magic, I think, every time.
So maybe the story itself is the Grail or the Philosopher's Stone,
That I think is a very neat way of looking at it. The process of looking for the Grail is the beginning of finding the Grail, and in that sense, it's a bit like what St. Augustine says about God: "You wouldn't look for me if you did not have me already." We wouldn't ask ourselves, "What is the Grail?" if we didn't already have something.
And like the old saying goes, every quest starts with a question.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, this has been really great. Can you talk a little bit about the forthcoming books? Where are you at with, I think the book on Faust would be next in the lineup?
That's right. I'm very glad that Chiron have taken on this project, and it's really genuinely been a pleasure to work with them. What I'm working on as we speak almost were it not for the exam season that we're going through, is volume 2 of the Epic of Transformation on Goethe's Faust, parts 1 and 2. So it's a lot to pack into one volume. Then the year after that, it's Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Obviously, there the major reference point is going to be the seminar that Jung gives from 934 to 939 on Nietzsche's Zarathustra. But I hope that cumulatively across volumes 1, 2, 3, patterns will be seen to be emerging before finally, in my final self-destructive act, I turn to the Red Book, and I hope that the idea is for us to see a continuity between these epic, in all senses of the word, these epic texts and the Red Book. And I'd like to propose a reading of the Red Book as in itself an epic. So I've got my work cut out.
Yeah, it sounds like working on your magnum opus here. Well, I hope that we can make these conversations maybe an annual event as the new volumes come out, because I really enjoyed talking with you, and I mean, you're interested in all these things I'm interested in and have gone really deep on them. So it's really great to have this latest volume that references all the different interpretations and everything, and kind of puts it all in with that through line of Jung, and seeing through symbolically and psychologically. It's great.
Well, thank you very much, and I've really enjoyed our discussion too. Thank you for your interest.